No Jeff Bell this week. You guys are stuck with me driving the ship. Jeff's at a funeral, so condolences to Jeff. He's mourning the loss of the Bills championship aspirations. So he's not actually at a funeral. He has some family obligations, but there was a death of the Buffalo Bills championship era. And we're here for week 11. Phil, welcome back. Dan, good to see you. First time on the show with you since, God, back when we were doing the 6-person power grid shows. So it's been a while. But I know you
Yeah.
filled in for me earlier this year. So let's get started, boys. Last week was a good week. Not a good week for the commenters that are haters in the chat. Those that told us that we were crazy for saying Najee Harris in cash or all of Devin's takes are bad. There will be bad takes this week. Trust me, I can't get everything right again. Or can I? Phil, what games are we targeting this week?
Yeah, so it's an interesting slate. We've got 7 out of the 11 games with a team favored by at least one touchdown. So there's a healthy amount of games to target, or at least a lot of sides to target, and a lot of different ways to attack the slate in general. So I think for the second straight week, it's going to be really fun to play it out. As far as the specific games go, I kind of grouped it into ones that are high scoring and might stay close, and then potential blowouts where game stacks make a little bit more sense. So you've got Cardinals at Texans with a 48.5 point over under. And of course, we've got CJ Stroud on fire. We've got Kyler Murray back and looking good. So that one seems solid and like it'll be competitive. You've got Seattle at the Rams with Matthew Stafford back and the Rams off a bye. That totals at 46.5. Then there's one that I'm like mildly interested in, which is Chargers at Packers at a 43.5 point total. It's definitely not the best looking game on this slate, but I think there's definitely some interesting pieces on both sides. And I'll kick it over to Dan from there, and then we'll come back and see if there's anything else. But I'm sure that he's going to mention some of these big favorites.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to kind of look at it. I think one of the ways I like to kind of view things is comparing their team total this week to how they've done on the season. And from that perspective, there's 3 games where both teams are projected to score a good bit higher than normal. The first one is Texans-Cardinals, which makes sense. Kyler Murray's back, so that raises the ceiling of that Arizona offense. And then, of course, the Texans have been on fire. Another one, Commanders and Giants. I mean, Giants doing better than normal still doesn't make it super interesting. But Washington is projected to score a good bit more than normal.
I know you're filling in. I have to interrupt.
Yeah.
We made a pact on this show that we are not playing Tommy DeVito or anyone on the Giants. So I will not entertain any Giants talk on this show.
Yeah. I'm kind of off that. And then the third game that kind of fits in that mold, though, where the teams are expected to score a good bit more than normal, is the Seattle versus LA Rams game. So kind of in addition to those teams that always score a bunch like Miami and Detroit, it could be a good week to target some of these teams that are expected to do better than normal. And I think especially the Texans-Cardinals game, there's a lot of really nice bargains in that one. So that's probably my favorite game of the week.
Let's go to quarterbacks, and we're going to start in cash. And is it as simple as just playing Brock Purdy? Like, that's where I want to go to start. I think, realistically, you have a couple different options. Jordan Love facing the Chargers, I think, is going to be interesting, but just because the Chargers secondary is so atrocious. They're allowing 314 passing yards per game. And Jordan Love threw for 280, but that could just be, that game could just be a slog. Dorian Thompson-Robinson at 4,500. Everyone knows my feelings about Dorian Thompson-Robinson not going back there, but I expect him to be a little bit better than his, going up against the Ravens and having more than 20 minutes to be a starter like he was this past in his prior start. But for me, I think it's just Purdy and moving on, but Dan convinced me otherwise.
I actually have Purdy tops on my list too. He scored 21 points or more in 5 of his 7 games, last 7. Bucks give up the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. It just kind of all checks out. The other guy, if I was kind of like a runner-up for me, is Sam Howell. He's thrown 41 or more passes in 4 straight games. He's just thrown the ball so much. He actually has 47 more pass attempts this year than any other quarterback in the NFL. He's got 397. Josh Allen's sitting there at 350. And he's priced down pretty reasonable at 6,300 against a bad Giants defense that just got torched by Dallas. He's 500 more than Purdy. I think I do like Purdy more in cash, but Howell is kind of my runner-up for cash.
Phil?
Man, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt after last week, Devin, but I was not expecting to lead off with Jordan Love and Dorian Thompson-Robinson in cash.
I said they were interesting. I did not recommend them. Let's be very clear. So comment section, I know you're already typing like Devin's an idiot. Let's stop with that. I did say that Brock Purdy was the primary guy.
Yeah, I mean, I got a big set of eyebrows, and they were nearly singed off by those takes. That was wild. But yeah, it's Purdy. For me, it was between Purdy and Kyler Murray. I think that Murray's price is still a bit too low, but Murray has the better matchup. He's better positioned as a double-digit home favorite. And, I don't want to double count those things because they're all baked into Purdy's projection, but I do have him projected for more points than Murray. And I think as we go through the build of a cash lineup this week, we're going to see some other spots where we could get exposure to Murray and the Cardinals, and stick with Purdy at quarterback. So I think that's about it. The only other name I have was Geno Smith, but the floor is entirely too low there, even though he projects pretty well and the matchup is good against the Rams. So
yeah,
I think
he's a GPP guy. I do like Geno, but far too low of a floor, I think, in cash. I mean, he's thrown for under 150, I think 3 times this season. So I don't really want to entertain that. I mean, Dorian Thompson-Robinson could throw for more. All right, running backs. Phil.
Starts with
let's talk about this for a second. San Francisco scores 4 touchdowns. Can we take McCaffrey and Purdy?
I think so. And I think they even correlate a bit because McCaffrey could always catch one. McCaffrey's on my list. I have some second thoughts about it, but I do want to play him again. I played him last week in cash, and he was a little bit disappointing. But when you look at it, he fell 5 yards short of the 100-yard bonus. And we got the first week in the last 18 that he didn't score a touchdown, even though they tried really hard to get him one. So I think we kind of ran bad last week playing Purdy in cash. And even though the rushing matchup this week isn't great, again, the 49ers are a double-digit favorite at home. They're going to score points. And I can't imagine that type of output again where McCaffrey is not involved.
You got his floor game of 20.2 DraftKings points. Just let's just be clear. That's
exactly. Exactly. And it certainly didn't kill you, even if it did prevent you from getting to some other better plays. But I have McCaffrey, and I think it's possible because Devin Singletary looks like the best point per dollar value on the slate from where I'm standing. Dameon Pierce missed practice again today, so it looks like a 3rd straight start for Singletary. And what we've seen so far is his first start was a major struggle in a difficult matchup against the Bucs. Then last week he exploded for 26 points. Matchup against the Bengals was kind of neutral. And this week's matchup tilts to all the way favorable against the Cardinals. Whether we look at the whole season or just the last 5 weeks, Arizona's allowed the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So it starts with those two for me, but I will say the one name that will make me rethink probably my entire build is Brian Robinson if Antonio Gibson continues to miss. because he's got the Giants. Washington's a big favorite. And if he's got a 3-down roll at sub 6K, I think you have to consider that. So maybe either he works in at flex or he replaces McCaffrey, and I put a little bit more of that spending elsewhere. I'm not too sure yet.
Dan, where are you looking? Did we lose Dan? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, my dog's kind of walking around here, so I'm trying to mute when I can. Yeah, I agree with Phil on Singletary. Just 31 touches last week, and he's 5,300. Cardinals giving up the third most fantasy points to running backs. I'm interested in Aaron Jones. 2 weeks ago, the coach said we're going to unleash him, and since then he's had 33 carries, 12 targets in his last 2 games. The Bears have given up 615 receiving yards to running backs this year, which is the most by, I think, like 125. Nobody else is over 500. So it's a really nice matchup for Aaron Jones. He's still priced down at 6,200. Breece Hall is interesting at 6,400. He played season high 70% of snaps last week. He's been averaging 15 carries, right around 5 targets a game. Michael Carter just got cut. Bills kind of a reputation of being a tough defense, but they've been getting eaten up lately, and they're top 10 in running back points against. So those are kind of the 3 guys in that lower price range that I'd be looking at in cash.
One name I didn't hear mentioned, and Breece Hall is 6,200. Josh Jacobs is $600 more. And 26 carries, 27 carries over the last 2 games. And I guess the blowout factor is like a thing there. But since this new coach, Antonio Pierce, has taken over, they've like made a concerted effort to get Jacobs the ball. So I think he's going to be popular. I think he's a guy who, we're looking for consistent touches at the running back position. Hasn't really caught the ball. He's only caught 2 passes, which I guess like is kind of weird that you would expect him to catch more. So maybe there's upside there as far as catching some additional volume. The only other name I have, no, we'll save it for GPPs. Okay, let's go to wide receiver. And Phil, I'm going to go back to you.
Yeah,
Sounds like we're going to go a little expensive. So do we have some value here?
I think we do have some value, but I'm not done spending because the first thing that I want to do is get Tyreek Hill in my lineup. Playing 2 guys at 9,300 is not easy, but I'm going to really try to. Yeah, I'm going to try to jam it in this week. We've got the Dolphins with this massive total, and we know what we're getting with Hill this year. It's 30% of the targets, 40% of the air yards, and 40% of whatever touchdown passes Tua is going to throw, along with a handful of explosive plays. So he's my number 1 receiver from a projected points standpoint by quite a bit. So I just want to get those points in there if I can. Tank Dell in the middle range. If we were scared about what was going to happen with his usage with every Houston wide receiver healthy, it looks like we might catch a break because Noah Brown hasn't practiced this week with a knee injury. But regardless of what happens with Brown, I still want to play Dell because he's just been playing too well to take off the field. Matt Waldman, in this week's Roundtable article, he had asked a question about Dell, and I was looking for some stats to justify my answer, and I happened across ESPN Analytics, which I didn't know were a thing, and they have this open score for wide receivers that measures the likelihood a receiver would be able to complete a catch if he were targeted on every play, and that's kind of a measure of getting open, right? So Dell is the 3rd best receiver in the league at getting open behind Keenan Allen and Brandon Ayuk this year. That's pretty impressive company, and it tells me he's going to continue to get targeted at least a 20% clip per game, period. And obviously, we talked about the fact that Cardinals Houston is a good spot. And then speaking of that, where I am paying down is with Michael Wilson of the Cardinals. His usage is consistent, in that 17 to 19% target share range. Every week, he almost had a really nice touchdown from Kyler Murray last week, even though it would have been a really tough catch. But it's him or Rondale Moore, and I prefer Wilson just because he's a more traditional X receiver. I think he's just a good prospect, and a guy like Murray could unlock his potential. We almost saw it last week. We didn't, so he's still cheap, and I'm willing to go back to it.
Dan, where are we looking?
Yeah, I have the same three guys as Phil. So my first build, I had Tyreek Hill, Tank Dell, Michael Wilson. I'm not playing McCaffrey. I kind of just want one expensive guy, so I stuck with Hill. So my fourth guy is DJ Moore. He's priced down at 5,600. His last two games with Justin Fields were when he really went off. 361 yards, 4 touchdowns. Great matchup. So those are my four guys in cash.
So you guys really like Tyreek Hill over CeeDee Lamb?
I think so. That might just be
it. Yards in 3 straight games. It's so tempting to go after Lamb in a. I have a bit of a narrative, and my narrative is: remember how AJ Brown had that record? I think the Cowboys are trying to take that away from AJ Brown. The 125 in six straight games. You don't think that's going through their mind a little bit?
Could
with
be.
3 straight games over 150 for Lamb. He's like the sole guy there. I think in the running game, I know Carolina's been better against the pass than against the run, but Tony Pollard is atrocious. Like, he's just not a good football player at this point. I might go Lamb over Hill, just based off of the hot streak this week. So I like Michael Wilson. I think we're going to get into another Wilson that I will like later. Terry McLaurin stays too cheap. And then one name I do like a little bit is Darnell Mooney. If you really wanted to go cheap at 33, he has 40 yards or more in 3 of his last 5 games at 3,300. So you could certainly do worse. It's ugly out there, boys. I mean, it is not something where you're going to feel comfortable building a roster this week because you have a lot of stars and scrubs. You have Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown might get popular because the Bears secondary isn't great. And then Tyreek at the top. The middle is pretty ugly besides Tank Dell. And then it's some bottom feeders, to be honest.
And there's really not a lot of good bottom feeders. I mean, those Arizona guys that we mentioned are pretty much all that I could see down there. So
yeah, I think it's an interesting week because you're going to have a lot of the roster percentages consolidate around some of these top end guys. And I think a lot of people are going to go stars and scrubs this week at the wide receiver position. So we'll get into GPP strategies in a little bit, but I do think it opens up the door for some interesting options at that position. Let's go to tight end. Phil, back to you. Where are we going?
Yeah, so we mentioned how ugly it is at wide receiver down in the bottom tier. And for the first time all year, because I hate doing this, I've currently got 2 tight ends plugged into my cash game lineup. And this was a result of playing both Hill and McCaffrey. So I still have some figuring out to do, but right now I've got Trey McBride at 4,400. I'm just going to keep rolling him out until he's priced at least over 5K. Target shares of 40, 28, and 30% since Zach Ertz hit injured reserve. He's got top two weekly finishes at the position in those 3 games. It's a good environment this week. No team has allowed more DraftKings points to tight ends than Houston. Tanner Hudson, for goodness sake, had 6 catches against them last week. So he's one. And then Evan Ingram is the other at 4,300. I have him at a pretty good point per dollar value. Prior to last week, when the Jaguars just got squashed by the 49ers and the offense never got off the ground, his season low in DraftKings points was 6.8. And in every other game, he's been between 9 and 18. So I think at 4,300, if I'm looking for that floor play in the 4Ks, I think you could look at him as like a low end wide receiver, even though he plays tight end, and you could flex him in. But I'm hoping to come up with something better by Sunday. But that's what I got right now.
Dan?
Yeah, I agree on McBride. I think he's kind of the slam dunk play. He's had 43.7% of the Cardinals receiving fantasy points over the last 3 weeks, which is just crazy. And he's getting a bunch of targets. He's also getting them deep down the field. He's at 36% of the team's air yards, which is like elite wide receiver 1 territory. 2 other guys who I do kind of want to mention. One is Pat Freiermuth. He's coming back from the hamstring injury. He's priced at 2,500. Full practice today. He wasn't doing a whole lot to start the year, and I don't like the Steelers' passing game. But for a guy that talented, who we know is probably going to be one of the top 2 or 3 targets in the offense, at full-on minimum 2,500, that's an interesting name. Again, that Browns Steelers game's ugly, so I don't know if I'm going to go there. But if you're really trying to do the stars and scrubs, he opens up a lot of possibilities. The other guy's Dalton Kincaid. Over the last 3 weeks, he has the same number of targets as Stephon Diggs, and he's actually outscored Diggs. He's priced up a little bit at 4,900, but I just think he's emerging as a guy who's going to get like 6 catches every week.
So for me, I do like Dalton Kincaid. I like Trey McBride a little bit more, just because he's cheaper. But I'll go a little bit cheaper here. And I know we've said this game is ugly. This Browns-Steelers game, I'm on the other side. David Njoku is interesting this week. And if you look at Dorian Thompson-Robinson in his first start, who his primary target was, it was David Njoku. He was the only receiver who had more than 20 yards receiving. He had 6 for 46. Amari Cooper was a non-factor. He caught 1 of his 6 targets. So 6 for 46. I do think Thompson Robinson is a little bit better than he has to be better than his last start. And a big part of that, I think, is Njoku at 3,900. If he can catch even 6 for 46 at 39, you'll probably take it. But if he can catch 7-8 passes, 60 yards, like that's really, really strong in there. Maybe, touchdowns are always so hard to predict, but the other player on that Browns team to potentially target is Jerome Ford. He caught 5 passes with Thompson Robinson. So Thompson Robinson, probably not a great quarterback, but he's targeting, like a lot of rookies, their running backs and their tight ends. So something to look at this week. I'm not going to do the whole Jeff Bell's special where he's like, subscribe to Football Guys, and I don't have that script and I don't have that polish. So all I'll say is subscribe to the video, give this a like, have a comment. It can be mean to me, be nice to Dan. He's a guest. We treat our guests well. It can be, hey, Phil, take off the hat next episode. It could be John Lee needs to come back. It could be whatever you want. But leave a comment, give us a like, hit that little subscribe button, and let's move on to GPPs. Quarterbacks. This is where Geno Smith comes into play. I think Geno is in a really good spot going up against the Rams. Phil, I'm sorry I'm stealing your thunder, but the Rams have been sort of all over the place when it comes to defending the pass. We saw 304 and 4 touchdowns against Dak Prescott. Jalen Hurts threw for over 300. They've faced a pretty easy schedule this season, but if they've allowed 200 yards or more to every quarterback that they've faced since week 1, which they faced Geno Smith and held him to 112 yards. I think that this is a game where the Seahawks looked good last week throwing the ball. Running the ball, they really have been inconsistent from time to time, and this is a get-right game. The other quarterback I do like for GPPs, Jordan Love. I talked a little bit about it. This is where I think Jordan Love has some upside. The Chargers can't stop anybody. I mean, it's 316 yards passing per game, which is 32 yards more than the next closest team, which is Tampa Bay. So they have some interesting stacking options that are pretty cheap, whether that's Luke Musgrave or Christian Watson or even Aaron Jones. I think you could probably stack him in there too, based off of his receiving prowess. But Dan, I'm going to start with you. Where are we looking at the quarterback position?
Yes, I already mentioned Sam Howell, so I won't go over him again. I do like him this week, but my favorite GPP play is Justin Fields. He ran all over the Lions in both games last season. So he had 279 rushing yards in 2 games against the Lions. The Lions have given up a ton of yards to Lamar Jackson and Justin Herbert just in the last 3 weeks. And it's worth remembering that Fields' last 2 games before he got injured, he threw 4 touchdowns in each game. So he's on my list, and especially because, like DJ Moore and Cole Kmet are priced way down, so you can really get some very cheap stacks in there. Another guy, Phil mentioned Kyler Murray. I was a little surprised he ran as much as he did. He had 6 carries, 33 yards, and a touchdown last week, first week back from a knee injury. And just from like an eye test, he didn't look like a guy who was just fresh off an ACL injury. So if he's running around, and he's probably going to have to keep up with CJ Stroud. And then we already mentioned how cheap guys like Trey McBride, Michael Wilson are, and even Marquise Brown's only 5,300. So you have some really nice stacking options there. So I like those 2 guys for their rushing upside. And also, I think they've have some passing upside too in those matchups. And then 2 other guys who are a little bit more expensive, but I in my player pool for sure, Dak Prescott. Again, we kind of mentioned the matchup versus Carolina is not great, but he has 3 straight games with 30 points. I mean, you just can't ignore it. And then also CJ Stroud. Again, he's priced up a little bit to 7,000, but he has 826 passing yards in his last 2 games, and he's starting to run a little bit more. He has 2 rushing touchdowns his last 3. So that's kind of the group of guys I'm looking at.
Phil, tell me why Dorian Thompson-Robinson is a good GPP play.
Nope, I will not do it.
How many points? How many points does DTR need to justify McCaffrey and Hill at 1% rostered?
But he's only $1,000 less than guys like Purdy, so it's just it's not like it opens up that much.
What if you? Yeah, fair.
He would have to be so much better than he was in that first game. I mean, I don't know. That is not calculus that I've done to this point. I'm just.
I've done it, but I don't want to share it. I'm going to keep that 1% in my back pocket.
There you go. My 2 guys are Tua. Again, the Dolphins are implied for 30 at home off a bye against a not great defense. You have to play him somewhere. He doesn't fit in cash lineups. But what I will say is that if you play him in GPPs, I think you're probably looking to like triple stack them and 5 stack the game. That way you make the lineup unique, because plain old Tua, Hill, and Waddle is probably not going to cut it. That's going to be a pretty common stack. So, think of some ways to make that Tua stack unique, but he's definitely got, I think, the highest ceiling out of anybody that I'm looking at here on this slate. And then the second one that I like, which is definitely not going to be popular, I don't think, is Trevor Lawrence. It's gotten to the point where behind the scenes last week, our staff was talking about, like, is this guy even good? And if that's happening in our little bubble, I have to think that the public is going to be way off the Jags after they got smacked by the 49ers. Dan talked about how affordable the Arizona stack is. I mean, look at the prices on some of these Jacksonville guys. You got Ridley at 5,400, Kirk at 6K, Ingram at 4,300. ETN's price is fair for his workload. I think this is a get right spot. The Titans are struggling. They've dropped their last 2 games. Will Levis has come crashing down to earth. Um, and I still think that Lawrence possesses enough upside to win you a tournament. So those are 2 guys that caught my eye that hadn't been mentioned. Go ahead, Devin.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, I mean, I get. Sorry, go ahead. I was gonna say Lawrence has 1 game over 20 fantasy points this year, and it was 20.7. So we saw a little bit of upside late last year. It's just consistently in the kind of mid to high teens every game this year, it feels like. But he's a talented guy, so I guess I can see it a little bit.
He's getting cheaper. 6K in a good matchup helps. Well, yeah, but
I mean, he hasn't thrown 3 touchdowns in a game since December 18th last year.
So you're telling me he's due?
Yeah, he should start wearing 2 gloves. I think that would help
Oh,
him. Let's go to running back. I know Dan. I know a name that's going to come up in Dan's list. I'm predicting the future. So Dan, Saquon Barkley is on your list.
He's not. No, I'm not playing any Giants.
I thought I thought for sure he was going to be on your list. All right, tell me about running back.
He did not make my list. So I do have Aaron Jones on there because I mentioned him in cash, but I don't think he's going to be super popular this week. One of the guys who I really like in tournaments is Jahmyr Gibbs. 14 carries, 5 targets last week, even with David Montgomery back. And one of the things I thought was really interesting and very bullish for Gibbs long term, he had 5 touches inside the 10-yard line last week, even with Montgomery back, and Monty had 2 carries inside the 10. And Gibbs did cash into those carries for touchdowns. So this is kind of looking like it's, like a 60-40, 65-35 split in favor of Gibbs now. And for a guy that explosive who's getting over 5 targets every game, you got to like that upside there. I mean, the Bears are a somewhat tough matchup, although, at least as a receiver, I think he can make some headway. And then another guy, I actually like Austin Eckler a little bit better than Christian McCaffrey this week. He's 600 cheaper. And the Packers are giving up the 7th most points to opposing running backs. Eckler has a 20% target share over the last 3 games and a 65% share carries. And I think part of the reason he's priced down a little bit, not that 8,600 is real cheap, is he just has had some bad touchdown luck where he's been tackled at the 1 a few times. So I actually like him a little bit better than McCaffrey and GPPs this week.
Phil?
Yeah, I had Gibbs on my list too, but I do have a note that I wonder about the ownership. I saw Devin. I think you had him at 12%. I think in my own head, and it's more of a guess than any type of mathematical formula, but I could see him coming in closer to like 18. And I think that's where I would start hesitating a little bit if he did get into that 18 to 20 range, because he is in a timeshare. Sometimes those chunk plays aren't there, but he definitely pops in the projections, and he is awfully fun to click. I just wonder if everybody.
See, I think a lot of people are going to stay away because of that timeshare. And they're looking at some competitor sites. They're right in line with 13. I see a 10 out there.
Okay.
A lot of people are just going to say, look, there are so many options. 7K is a little bit of a weird price. That I don't think he's going to get up as high as you think he is because of that timeshare.
All right, that's good. Then I'm playing him over the field. My other one is Raheem Mostert at 6,900. I mentioned that you want to put some sort of leverage in your Tua stacks. I think that's one way to do it, is to put
Not
Mostert
Devon
in
Achane.
there. So I don't know what to do with Devon Achane yet, but I know that Mostert has been playing banged up. I think he needed the bye week. I think he's going to come back healthy. And this is total narrative, and this is just a story I'm telling myself. But the Dolphins are leading that division by a couple of games now. They've got their eyes on the playoffs. They know what they've got in HN at this point. They also know that he turned out to be a little bit fragile, right? He's a smaller back. Could they ease him back in and try to save his best for the stretch run? I think it's possible because I think that they feel if they were to lose Mostert, they have kind of like a double for him and Jeff Wilson. So that's how I'm convincing myself to play Mostert anyway. Bottom line is I think he's going to be like 2% owned in this game where the Dolphins are projected to score 30 and they're huge favorites at home. And I think he's got like a better than 2% chance of finishing as the overall running back one on this slate. If things break a certain way, Achan's interesting. I just right now I'm clicking on Mostert first.
Both of the, Achan I have right now, both of those guys are going to be low. They're going to be 1% to 2%. So if one of those guys pops, it could be a big day. Do you have any more, Phil, or you good?
That was it for me.
All right, so a couple names. I know Jacksonville's run defense has been good. And I know Derrick Henry has been really bad. However, Derrick Henry right now is projected to be rostered in about 4% of rosters. And it's a different Jaguars team. But if we look at his last 4 games against his team, 215-2, 130-3. He had 109, and where's the last one? 121-1. I know it's not like the Jaguars are much better in 2023. However, like they have to. It's basically like Derrick Henry either is going to be good this year or he's not, and it's probably not. But this is a team that Jacksonville, while they've been great, they do have some games where they have padded their stats a little bit, right? So James Cook had 5 carries for -4 yards against this run defense. That completely changes the dynamics. They've shut down Indianapolis twice, but they've struggled against good running backs. So Isaiah Pacheco had 12 for 70. Bijan Robinson had 14 for 105. Alvin Kamara had 153 total yards. Christian McCaffrey had 52 total yards last week. It's a scenario where at 4% rostered, I know there's a lot of skepticism on Henry, but I'm not ruling out another 100-yard multi-touchdown game.
Could I jump in there real quick?
Tell me I'm an idiot.
No, I'm not. I'm jumping in support of that call. He hasn't been that bad. In weeks 6, 8, and 9, his last 3 games before last week against Tampa, he scored exactly 19.2 DraftKings points in each of them. And I think that the drop in his price, he was 7,400 in week 10. He's 6,300 on DraftKings this week. That's a staggering price drop. And I think an overreaction to that Tampa game. And the other thing to look at, too, is that in the first 2 games with Will Levis at quarterback, he saw 4 targets before the one that he got last week. So I think that could be a really sneaky play. And if I'm right about the Jaguars putting up points, maybe that's a sneaky game to stack.
Yeah, there's a scenario where Tennessee gets out to an early lead because of Derrick Henry, and then Jacksonville has to come back throwing the ball. So Josh Jacobs, I mentioned him at 6,800. It's just a volume play. And if they get behind, I think the volume could turn from rush attempts to pass attempts, which you could see 5, 6, 7 receptions there. I think Jerome Ford is interesting at 5,200. Maybe it's just my Browns stupidity. I think this game is going way over, just like we saw in Baltimore last week. We talked about it for a lot of the show last week as far as the Ravens-Browns game going significantly over. I think there was 65 points scored total. The over-under's 33. Like, that's crazy. It's insane. It's insane. I think it's a 40 to 45 point game. I think DTR isn't as bad as 20-minute start DTR is. And Jerome Ford saw I think he saw five catches last time they played. I don't know why. I just think he's going to check down to Ford quite a bit this week. And then Tony Pollard, 6,600. Nobody's going to play him. Nobody should play him. Carolina is allowing the most touchdowns to running backs this season. It's a spot where CeeDee Lamb is going to be popular. Dak Prescott's going to be popular. Tony Pollard I have right now at 8%. So 2 touchdowns.
Can I throw one up?
Go ahead.
Yeah, on Pollard, I think one of the interesting things, and it reminded me of this a little bit as a Bengals fan, where Joe Mixon last year was getting all these carries, but it was so inefficient, and he hadn't topped 20 fantasy points all year. And then week 9 against Carolina, he went off for over 200 yards, 5 touchdowns. Everybody was playing Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow. And then it was just, they could not stop him. I think he had 4 touchdowns by halftime. And when I was kind of looking at the slate, that kind of popped into my mind a little bit as like, maybe this is the get right spot for Pollard after Dax had all these big weeks and CeeDee Lamb's had these huge weeks. Maybe they just run it all over Carolina to kind of add that element back into their offense. So I like that call a lot.
And if you think about getting a little more narrative-y, just because that's how I build GPP lineups a lot of the time, try and convince yourself of a narrative that could work. Michael Gallup scored a touchdown last week. Jake Ferguson scored a touchdown last week. CeeDee Lamb scored a touchdown last week. Dak Prescott ran for a touchdown last week. The only guy who didn't score a touchdown, Tony Pollard. I think he gets one this week. All right, let's go to wide receivers. Phil, talk to me.
So the first guy on my list is Brandon Ayuk. I had mentioned that Tank Dell is the 3rd best at getting open, according to that ESPN metric, and Ayuk was first. It's rough counting on him when everyone in San Francisco is healthy, as they are now. But I think that's probably why he's not going to be very popular. He scored last week. The 49ers put up a ton of points, and he still didn't pay off his salary. So I don't know if too many people are going to go back to him. But I think that the top producer in that passing game is subject to change each week. And I do like the spot against Tampa Bay a lot for Ayuk in particular. I think they're going to have all sorts of trouble defending him. Calvin Ridley, I think I mentioned him at 5,400. He's another one where I'm going to have to see where the ownership clocks in, because he's cheap and he's Calvin Ridley. And I think people are going to gravitate there because he was like 7,200 at one point this season. So people are going to see that savings and their eyes might open a little bit wider. But I don't know. Maybe on the other hand, I'm not too concerned because my plan to play Ridley is in correlated game stacks. I'm not really considering him as a one-off. So I think my lineups with him in it are going to be a little different than everybody else's anyway. And then the Rams receivers. Cooper Kupp at 8,100 and Puka Nacua at 71. I think both of these guys are awesome for GPPs. They've been out of sight, out of mind on the bye week. Neither one of them has had a good game since like week 7. But since that time, they had at Dallas, which was tough, at Green Bay, which isn't the best, and that was with Brett Rippon. So they've been in some terrible spots. And I think with a healthy Stafford, Nacua was banged up. Kupp, who knows? He had the early season injury. I think they might come out as healthy as they've been. And I wouldn't be shocked if they beat Seattle outright and those receivers put up some big numbers.
Dan, talk to me about GPPs.
Yeah, so I do want to mention DJ Moore again. Like I said, I really like the Chicago stacks this week. I'm not sure how popular he'll be, but priced all the way down at 5,600. He's one of the few guys in that price range who's shown a huge ceiling. Another guy kind of in that same range is DeAndre Hopkins. He's been getting a bunch of targets the last few weeks. He just hasn't really converted since that huge first game with Levis. But I think he had 11 targets last week. He's a solid play against Jacksonville, who's top 10 in wide receiver fantasy points against. Another guy who I think is at least a little bit interesting, especially since you're talking up that Browns-Steelers game. Deontay Johnson has over half of the Steelers' air yards over the last 3 weeks. And he's priced all the way down at $5,000. So if you are of the mind, like you are, Devin, that game goes over 40 points, he's pretty interesting just because he's getting so many targets, and he's one of those guys who can, go for 8 and 100 pretty easily. And if he does that at 5K, you're in great shape.
Yep.
One more I'll throw out there, and it's a little bit of a homer pick, but Jackson Smith and Jigba. He's all the way down at 4,300. And he's one of those guys where I think because he's in a weird price range, he's not going to be as popular as guys like Michael Wilson and Rondale Moore when people go true stars and scrubs. He's kind of in that range where he might fly a little bit under the radar, but he's had at least 5 targets in 7 games this year, and he scored in 2 of his last 4. And he seems like he's kind of on an upward trajectory, and I do like that Seahawks-Rams game. Agree with the take on, Kupp and Nakua. I think those guys have such a wide range of outcomes. Like, I wouldn't touch them in cash. But, I mean, we've seen the Rams offense have huge days. And I think those guys, 71% of the targets from Stafford the last time out were just to those 2 guys. So if the Rams passing game does anything, it's one of those 2 guys getting it.
Yeah, the only other name I'll mention is Jaden Reed, $4,000. Like I've talked about, targeting the Chargers secondary. Jaden Reed has 80 yards or more in 2 of his last 3 games. He is their wide receiver 1. I mean, Christian Watson just hasn't been producing. So if Jordan Love has a big game, it's likely going to be off of some big plays from Jaden Reed this week. Tight ends. I think Trey McBride is going to be one of the most popular players of the week. It's going to be interesting because I tend to think if he gets over, I don't know, Phil, what is the number that you would be cautious about playing Trey McBride? 25%?
I was going to say 25%.
Yeah, so right now he's at 18. In my latest update that'll be published tonight. I think he's still the guy. I mean, there's other options. I think Dalton Kincaid is an option. Jake Ferguson continues to just catch touchdowns and get red zone targets. He has 3 straight games of touchdowns, and we've been talking about him all year as far as leading the Cowboys in red zone targets, and he's top 3 in tight end red zone targets across the board. But for me, it's Trey McBride unless you really wanted to diversify and go with one of those other guys.
Yeah, I'll throw a couple of names out. I do agree. Like, I think McBride's a great play because part of it, I mean, he's probably going to get you at least 10 or 15 points. So maybe you don't have the tight end one, but he's not going to tank your lineup most likely. But I do like Cole Kmet down at 4,100. Again, I keep mentioning the Bears. His last 2 games with Fields, he had 12 catches, 127 yards, 3 touchdowns. He played Detroit twice last year. Between those 2 games, he got 3 touchdowns. He's had 38% of the Bears receiving fantasy points the last 3 weeks. He's one of those guys where people don't like to play him, but he's been putting up really good numbers. And another guy who I'll mention is Dalton Schultz. He's priced up a little bit now at 5K. He'd been a lot cheaper, but he's averaged over 15 fantasy points a game over his last 6, 4 touchdowns. He's averaging 60 yards a game. And he just looks good. It looks like him and Stroud are really on the same page now. So I think he's a solid play at 5,000.
Phil?
Yep. I had Schultz also, and two other names. One is Sam Laporta. I think there could be a multi-touchdown game incoming from him. Um, the Lions have the second highest implied total besides Miami. I like to get my tight ends on big home favorites like that because that's where the touchdowns happen. And he's got a great matchup
What
with the
does that
Bears
have to
there.
do with anything?
What do you mean?
Oh, you're saying big favorites. I got you. I thought you were just saying like tight ends score more at home. I'm like, what?
No, if they're heavily favored, and usually the
I get
team who is heavily favored is at home anyway. That's usually when you could count on like the random tight end touchdown. But with Laporta, he's one of the main cogs in that offense. And over the last 3 weeks, they've allowed the Bears have 42% more DraftKings points, two tight ends than league average. And those matchups in the last three games were the Chargers, the Saints, and the Panthers, and they don't really feature tight ends in the offense. So I think that's a good spot for him. And Luke Musgrave was the other one at 3,600. Kind of a pure matchup play, but the Chargers have been getting strafed by tight ends recently. Musgrave has at least 4 catches and 50 receiving yards in each of his last two. And if one of those catches happens to go for a touchdown this week, you're in business in tournaments because I don't think he's going to be particularly owned either. And just real quick on the note that Devin had about Trey McBride's ownership, one thing that I want everyone to keep in mind is that the individual ownership of the player matters less than the cumulative ownership of your lineup, right? So there's nothing wrong with playing even a 25% owned Trey McBride as long as you build a lineup around it that's going to separate from the field in another spot or in another two spots, right? One way to do it is, like I said before, not too many people are stacking 5 players in the same game. So you could get a chalky game like Houston, Arizona is going to be this week. And if you really kind of build your entire lineup, you slot in 5 guys from that game, not too many people are going that route. And that's where you could get like a Trey McBride in there. So uh, it's lineups, not players, right?
or just select the players that score the most points and don't worry
Yeah,
about it.
that's it.
All
That's all
right,
the game
guys.
theory you need.
Stacks. Bill, where are we looking?
It's Jaguars with an optional bring back. So something like Lawrence Etienne Ridley, Lawrence Kirk Ridley, Lawrence Kirk Ingram. There's a lot of ways you could go. And then if you're going to bring it back, I think we talked about Derrick Henry as an interesting option. Uh, and then you could just play chalk pretty much everywhere else. Or DeAndre Hopkins, like Dan had said. Both of those guys have ceilings.
Dan?
Yeah, like I've mentioned it already, but I really like field stacks this week, especially with DJ Moore. Just they have so much big play potential, and I think we know Detroit's going to score, especially at home. So that has the potential to be a shootout. And I don't know if people are going to want to play Fields his first game back after that thumb injury, but it's a really great matchup. The Lions don't really blitz, which is what generally gives Fields trouble. And they've showed some real cracks lately. They gave up 30 plus to the Chargers and the Ravens. So I think that's a really nice spot. We already mentioned some of the Cardinal stacks, especially because Kyler's weapons are so cheap and he has that rushing upside. That's probably my favorite game situation to stack. Either side of it, I really do like Stroud and Dell and those guys too.
Okay, so are there any cheap guys that we haven't mentioned or who is your favorite value play of the week? I know we've mentioned a lot. Michael Wilson, Rondale Moore. I mentioned Jaden Reed. Phil, is there anybody else that you're missing, or is there a guy you wanted to expand on that we didn't cover so far on the show?
For value plays,
Just anybody.
we pretty much hit on everyone on my list. I think like one of the biggest decision points is going to be what to do with Achan. So that's where I'm putting a lot of my brain power over the next couple of days. And I think Dan might have convinced me on these Chicago stacks. That's starting to sound pretty appealing now.
Dan, is there
I'll
any
throw out.
value plays or anybody else you want to talk
Yeah,
about?
there's one guy who, and I like him a little bit more on FanDuel, where he's priced down at 5,000 than I do on DraftKings, where he's 4,600, which is not nearly as much of a discount compared to the other running backs. That's Zach Charbonnet. He's played over half the snaps each of the last 3 weeks. He was. There's been some really glowing comments coming out of Seattle about him lately, where they love everything about him. I saw Pete Carroll said this week there's going to be some games where he gets um, more touches than Kenneth Walker. I think he's really coming on. He was, when they 4th and 1 game on the line, they went with Charbonnet last week. Pretty nice matchup against the Rams. Rams have generally been okay against running backs, but Seattle's ran on them in the past. And I really like that $5,000 price tag on FanDuel because there's almost nothing under about 6,500 at running back this week. So it gives you a chance to build a really unique lineup because you're getting a huge discount there. And again, he's played, like 53, 55% of the snaps each of the last 3 weeks and seems to be kind of coming on, challenging Kenneth Walker for that lead role.
So Jeff mentioned Zach Charbonnet, and I wasn't as nice to Jeff last week because we mentioned early on in the show, we are nice to guests here, and we appreciate Dan coming on to this show. We are not going to criticize that pick. So with that said, like I said, leave a comment. What do you think of Zach Charbonnet? Again, be nice to Dan. You don't have to be nice to Charbonnet, though. He went to Michigan, so you don't have to be nice. Dan, I really appreciate you coming on a last minute notice. Phil, thanks as always. And with that, we are getting towards the last third of the season, guys. It's flying by. Now is the time to really try to take some chances on some things that haven't happened yet, but you think could. A lot of the times we just write players off, we dismiss them, and then like who was it? Phil mentioned Joe Mixon or Dan? I don't remember at this point. One of you guys mentioned the Joe Mixon game against Carolina. If you're watching this video, you know. All right, and with that, we are out. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.